Bibliophiles of the internet, today I'm here to share what's going to be a pretty lengthy August wrap-up. August was an incredibly productive reading month for me. I was able to read, I want to say, 10 books, despite the fact that my life did not slow down. And I'm excited to talk about them with you, so let's just get right to it. This first book I started in July and understandably had to carry over into August because it's so stinking long, and that is When the World Tips Over by Jandy Nelson. Penguin Team very kindly sent me an early copy, and it comes out later this month on September 24th. It has been a solid 10 years since Jandy Nelson last published a book, and that was I'll Give You the Sun back in 2014. So this is her first new book in a decade, and it's a YA contemporary story that blends elements of coming of age, multi-generational family saga, and just a touch of fabulism to round things out. The story centers around these three siblings in the Fall family, Winton, Miles, and Dizzy, whose lives were forever changed when their father suddenly vanished from their lives without a trace. One day, this mysterious girl with rainbow-colored hair rolls into their small Northern California town and ends up appearing before each sibling when they're at their lowest point. And before they can figure out who she is and how she fits into their lives, she also vanishes. So it's basically about these siblings trying to find out more about this stranger, uncovering long-kept family secrets, and trying to find a way to heal their family before tragedy permanently tears them apart. Content warnings for bullying, some fatphobic comments and ableist language, descriptions of alcohol abuse, drunkenness, and drug abuse, references to suicide, depressive episodes, self-harm, and manic episodes, brief descriptions of sexual assault, some instances of child abuse, child endangerment, and child abandonment, descriptions of long-term hospitalization and severe medical trauma, and some non-graphic sexual content. I'm gonna say right off the bat, I kind of have complicated feelings about this book. Ultimately, I did enjoy it, and ultimately my view of the story as a whole and the way I feel about my personal reading experience with it is positive, but that doesn't mean I don't have some capital T thoughts. I think if you're already a fan of Jandy Nelson's work, as I am, you're most likely going to enjoy this. Her trademark off-the-wall lyricism, surprising prose, and distinctive character work are once again on full display in this winding, heart-wrenching family saga. It is deeply emotional, as you might guess, and I do think it really lands when it needs to. Keywords. I also appreciate the journey this story takes the reader on as it progresses. Even though I can't truthfully say that I was blown away by every single aspect of the story, I can say that it still feels like an unforgettable whirlwind of unfolding events. It's a unique story that puts mystery, road trips, family curses, generational lore, and just a touch of whimsy on a strangely poignant collision course. And where I think this book is most successful is definitely in its thematic explorations. In a lot of ways, I think this is a heartfelt ode to the unlikeliest of roads that lead us back to ourselves, and how the most common family curse that most of us are contending with is our own inability or unwillingness to forgive. Not necessarily to forgive the people we care about, although that might be one piece of it, but more so to forgive ourselves. And while there are these bits of fabulism or surrealism being slung around in the story, maybe a character has a strange ability or a seemingly magical knack for doing strange things, I think the story is actually exploring how the closest thing we as humans have to magic is time itself. Time is what makes history an ongoing experience, what makes the past seep into the present as something that's constantly happening to us. And I think that's a big part of the story, as these characters are finally connecting to their family history and seeing how the things they're experiencing are ongoing struggles that have been handed directly to them by their ancestors. And one of my favorite ideas that the story briefly taps into is the fact that we focus so much on generational curses, generational cycles of violence, patterns of violence and trauma in our family history, that we often forget that generational joy and liberation are part of that same package. All of that said, I personally feel like this story is far from perfect. For one thing, it is absolutely objectively too long. It is over 500 pages, which is not in itself an issue, but I don't think it fully earns that page count because I don't think it successfully sees everything through, and I don't think it closes the loop on some of the central character arcs for all the main characters, despite the fact that it has the luxury of that space. And especially in the YA space, there's a whole other dynamic of which authors are afforded that much space and which authors are forced to condense their stories, but that is something for another time. There were also romantic subplots for all the main characters in the story that A, I didn't love the power dynamics or social dynamics of, and B, I didn't feel like were fully fleshed out, and I don't think the story actually needed them in the end. There's also a main character, I won't say who or why, who isn't even active in the story for a majority of the book, which is kind of wild because I felt like they were the character who had the most growing and healing to do, and we don't actually get to see any of that development on page. I'm just going to ease on the brakes and stop myself there. I think you get the idea. While the story as a whole is worthwhile, and while I ultimately appreciate the project of the story and feel glad that I got to experience it for myself, I do think the book has its structural issues, and I think it somewhat falters in its execution. Jandy Nelson is the kind of writer who takes risks in her writing. Sometimes those risks pay off, and sometimes they don't. So somewhat of a mixed bag for me, although I still enjoyed and appreciate the experience of the story overall. I gave this one 3.75 stars, but on a good day in the right light, I could see that possibly being rounded up to 4 stars. After that, I listened to The Truth According to Ember by Danica Nava. I was gifted a finished copy by Berkeley Romance and granted access to the audiobook courtesy of PRH Audio, and the audiobook is read by Sienna East. This is an adult rom-com about Indigenous characters written by an Indigenous author. In fact, it is the first ever traditionally published romance written by a Native author to be published by a Big Five publishing house. The story is following a Chickasaw character named Ember who has a really bad habit of lying her way in and out of sticky situations. Recently, she's been really struggling to find herself a job, and she desperately needs the money to support her younger brother who has a history of incarceration, as well as her grandmother. So she decides to lie on her next job application by self-disclosing as white. Technically, it's only a half lie because her father is white, but regardless, it works and she lands herself the job. And of course, right after she's hired, onboarded, and informed about the company's strict no dating policy, she meets the incredibly attractive and suave IT guy, Danawa, who happens to be Native himself. Content warnings for references to child abandonment, experienced racism, descriptions of workplace harassment and extortion, some use of ableist language, and explicit sexual content. This was such a fun rom-com. I had such a great time with it. Not only, as I said, is it exceedingly rare in the traditional publishing space to have an Indigenous romance, much less an Indigenous romance where all the romantic characters are Indigenous themselves, but at the same time, the story isn't hung up on being groundbreaking. It's not trying to do too much. It's a charming, funny, endearing, sexy romance. I especially love Danica Nava's use of physical comedy in the story. It struck this weird balance for me where it made me nostalgic for the kinds of rom-coms we used to see in the 90s and early 2000s, but it was also refreshing to see these characters, or at the very least Ember, bumble their way through this romance. There's something especially messy about physical comedy, about fully committing your body to the bit no matter how disastrous things become, that I find so satisfying for a romance because in a weird way it allows the characters to build trust. Like if you start off a relationship with someone and they've already seen you at your worst or most chaotic and they still like you, that signals a sense of safety. I also just love that Danawa is the softest, hunkiest, most good-hearted man I've ever seen. He's dependable, he's level-headed, he's always down to clown, and he doesn't let Ember get away with anything. He always knows when she's bluffing, but he's also not going to embarrass her or undermine her in the moment, which is not only incredibly understanding, but also just endearing. So I just loved getting to see them become co-workers, then genuine friends, and eventually romantic partners. They're both funny and charismatic main characters, and it was also fun to see the shenanigans they got up to in the office. I feel like I can see where the story wanted to go in terms of this plot line about Ember constantly telling lies. To me, it seems like her childhood forced her to become this toxically independent person who learned that she can only rely on herself for anything she needs. So she doesn't know how to ask other people for help, and she thinks that saving face at any cost is how she can avoid failing outright. There's a lot of emotional depth there, and I do think the story is able to tap into that somewhat, especially with the rocky relationship that Ember has with her younger brother and her family, but at the same time, I think there was still space for the story to go even further with that concept. plot. But all in all, this was a fun and delightful office romance. It has heat, it has endearing characters, it has some good social commentary, although I do think the part about Ember lying about her ethnicity marker is kind of a red herring in terms of what the story is actually about, but I still had a great time with this, would definitely read more from Danica Nava in the future, and I gave this 4 stars. Then I picked up my copy of Libertad by Bessie Flores Zaldivar. Penguin Team very kindly sent me a finished copy, which is what I read from, and it actually recently released on August 27th. This is a queer YA coming-of-age story set entirely in Honduras, specifically during 2017 when the country was facing a rigged presidential election that threatened to tear the already struggling country apart. We're following a young queer teenager named Libertad who finds solace by writing radical political poetry on her secret Instagram account, which she makes sure to keep very locked down, and very few people in her life know about it, much less about her queerness. But when her mom sees some text messages on her phone mentioning a kiss that she had with a girl, all hell breaks loose. And to make things worse, Libertad also discovers that her older brother might be risking his life to take part in some very dangerous protests. Content warnings for instances of state-sanctioned police brutality and violence, gun violence, experienced homophobia, depictions of domestic violence, misogyny, family death, and grief, allusions to sexual assault, illegal distribution of intimate photos, instances of infidelity, and some fade to black sexual content. This is a truly incredible story. It's heavy, yes, by necessity and in service of the specific political moment it's committed to exploring, but I don't think that heaviness is ultimately what you take away from the story, and I don't think it should be a reason to put it off either. I am not Honduran, but there is so much of this story that I felt so incredibly deeply. First and foremost, I really appreciate this story's tender and complicated depiction of a multi-generational household, which is a fairly common experience across Latina cultures. The story is able to thoughtfully capture the emotional highs and lows of that experience, especially because this story is centered around the widespread effects of politics on the everyday person. Having that multi-generational perspective within one family allows the story to organically explore conflicting viewpoints. Different generations have different values and concerns. The history that your grandparents have seen is different from the history your parents have seen, is different from the history the current generation is watching unfold. So it makes sense that our political ideations, whether they fall on the same side or not, are also different. I love how that was captured in the story, how even though Libertad may not agree with her more conservative abuela or even her mom, the story makes space for those differing viewpoints and also shows that politics don't exist in a vacuum. Family ecosystems and family dynamics are also inherently political themselves. And related to that, above everything else, I deeply appreciate how the story is not interested in ascertaining easy answers for the reader. It's not a story focused on vilifying any group of people, but rather holding this singular moment in Honduran history up to the light to show that in this deeply corrupt system, there is no choice that is the obviously right choice. This story shows us that, rigged or not, the system itself can never be and will never be the people's salvation. We cannot expect to attain justice or fairness through broken systems. Voting for the lesser evil, abstaining from voting, feigning apoliticism, publicly protesting, leaving the country behind altogether. None of these were perfect answers in 2017 Honduras, and all had very serious and dangerous consequences, which the story shows. But while it might seem like there's no way for these characters to win, it's that feeling of hopelessness itself that actually forces them to revolutionize and radicalize their imaginations, to begin imagining and creating better ways to show up for their communities, for their families, for themselves. At its heart, this story is about how community is sacred, how caring about each other is a deeply revolutionary act, and how truly loving something or someone means being unafraid to talk about how those things or people have failed us. With Libertad's poetry, she's learning that it's because she loves her country so much that she can and should be critical of it, want better for it, and hold it to a higher standard. She's also experiencing that with the parental figures in her life who are undoubtedly loving and caring, but don't always make their home the easiest or safest space for Libertad and her siblings to exist. Being critical of the things you love doesn't make you a bad person or an angry person. Criticism doesn't automatically negate all the good things a thing or person has to offer either. Being able to say, I want better for myself and the people around me is actually a byproduct of love, because love love is what propels us forward, and love is what demands positive change. This is a deeply emotional and heart-wrenching story at times, but it beautifully balances moments of hopelessness with untenable hopefulness. It has great social commentary, but there's also unforgettable coming-of-age moments and tender moments of authentic human connection. I loved it so much. I highly recommend it, and I gave it 5 stars. On a very different note, after that, a few of my friends and I did a group buddy read of the cult classic If We Were Villains by M.L. Rio. Let me just say, if you love queer dark academia and Shakespeare, then this is the book for you. It's a mystery thriller kind of story set at this elite art conservatory where 7 close friends are 4th years in the theater program, and they spend every minute of every day studying, reciting, and performing Shakespeare's works. Over the years, they've kind of gotten pigeonholed in the same kind of roles: the hero, the villain, the tyrant, the temptress, etc. But when the cast list for their next production gets a major shakeup, it unleashes a well of untapped resentment, suspicion, and paranoia that begins to surface until the onstage drama spills dangerously over into real life, and one of them is found dead. Content warnings for some use of racist comments and sexual slurs, depictions of physical abuse and assault, violence, descriptions of death and fatal injuries, references to eating disorders, descriptions of drug abuse and drug overdose, some descriptions of PTSD, instances of self-harm and mentions of suicide, and some sexual content. This was absolutely wild in the best possible way, and we had such a great time with it. First, I do have to say, if you hate Shakespeare, if you hate reading Shakespeare, if Shakespeare's plays feel like a foreign language to you, then do not read this. You will hate this. Luckily, I don't have that problem because I am a fan of the Bard. I am familiar with many, though not all of his works, and I think that did give me a slight edge in being able to enjoy this. This book is entirely populated by Shakespearean actors who are purposefully pretentious, ostentatious, and eccentric. They unironically recite random Shakespearean quotes to each other, and I love that about them. What this book does so well is to maintain a constant sense of tension simmering just beneath the surface of this friend group. Because they're at this conservatory studying a very specific form of theater, you understand why they have such a tight-knit friendship, but you're also very aware that for the very same reason, that friendship might not have been a conscious choice. So the tension and the motive is kind of built into their dynamic because they're friends, and in some ways they're the only people who truly understand each other, but at the same time, they're each other's competition anytime they have to audition for a new production. And for obvious reasons, you can tell how much the author knows about Shakespeare's plays because she so effectively uses scenes from his work to foreshadow what's to come, but also as a way to very distinctly characterize these friends. There's a moment where the narrator, Oliver, is talking about the experience of channeling a character on stage while also contending with your own thoughts and feelings as a human that have nothing to do with the play, and processing those things parallel to each other in real time. There are multiple scenes in the story where the characters are performing something for an audience, but maybe they recently had an argument with one of their fellow actors on stage. Maybe they just learned something unsettling about one of their friends and they don't know whether what they learned is coloring that person's performance or if it's just in their head. Or maybe the way one of them is interpreting or performing the text is actually revealing something about themselves. So you're reading the actual Shakespearean text that the characters are performing, but you're also in Oliver's head, seeing how he's interpreting what's happening on stage, which may or may not be related to the performance itself. It very intentionally emulates that parallel perception process in a way that's so effective. As a mystery, I just found this to be so incredibly satisfying. For one, the characters are so unhinged and so toxic that you can never quite predict their next move or even fully understand why they make the choices they make, which keeps you guessing at every turn. And then when things do finally fall into place, you get the feeling that if you were to restart the story, you would read it in a completely different way and have a completely different experience, which is so hard to pull off. Thematically, I feel like the story is firstly a testimony to the lasting power of literature because, as Oliver points out, part of performing a written work is to create meaning and connection for the audience, to almost translate the intent of a text into something that's real and immediate and urgent. That's why it's so powerful to see the way these characters kind of adopt Shakespeare's writing and integrate it into their lives almost like a language of their own. And it shows how something that was written centuries ago can still help us make sense of our present day lives. But I also think it's about how ambition and ineptitude are feelings that ultimately seek to isolate us. When we're operating from a place of feeling like we're not enough or having to prove ourselves, that doesn't allow us to see the world around us or ourselves clearly. And ultimately, it's stemming from a place of fear. And misguided fear is what can make villains of any of us. Like I said, I had a great time with this. My friends enjoyed it as well. It was a hit in the group chat. I've already pre-ordered ML's upcoming novella and I can't wait to read that as well. I gave this 4.5 stars. After that, I picked up one of my most anticipated 2024 releases, The Palace of Eros by Guerra de Robertes. I was kindly sent a review copy by Atria Books and I also listened to the audiobook, which is read by the author themselves. This is a deeply queer Greek myth retelling. It tells the story of a mortal named Psyche who is incredibly beautiful and has captured the attention of men far and wide, whether she actually wants it or not, until stories of her beauty begin to spread throughout the land, and there are whisperings that she is even more beautiful than the goddess Aphrodite herself. Aphrodite obviously is not happy about that, and she curses the land and the family until Psyche's father has no choice but to seek out the oracle for their advice. And when he's told that Psyche is to be tied to a rock and left atop a cliff face to be ravaged by a monster, he does exactly that. But instead of being torn apart by a monster, Psyche is miraculously whisked away by Eros, a non-binary deity who's actually Aphrodite's offspring, and she flies Psyche to this mysterious palace that she's built and hidden away so they can explore this unorthodox relationship blooming between them and figure out whether a mortal and a god can truly be unified in marriage. Content warnings for explorations of colorism, descriptions of sexual harassment, references to domestic abuse, allusions to rape, and explicit sexual content. Just as a note, as the synopsis says, Eros is a non-binary deity. Non-binary people and people of all genders can use whatever pronouns they want, and Eros happens to use she/her pronouns, which is obviously what I'm also going to use in this review. This book is such a triumph. Guerra de Robertes is an incredibly talented author whose writing never disappoints, and this was no exception. In a way, it's a huge departure from the kinds of stories they usually tell, but at the same time, it feels like they were always meant to write this. The basis of this retelling has a fairly straightforward premise. It's very slow burn in its progression, especially in the sense that the central conflict of the story is not inherently obvious and only reveals itself over time. A great deal of this story is just dedicated to exploration in all its different forms, but I also love that the story gives the characters that space. It's honestly an understatement to say that Psyche and Eros have such a beautiful relationship. Imperfect, yes, but still unbelievably full of wonder and beauty and love. When they first meet each other, Psyche is in a place where she has to learn how to let herself trust someone again, which is a very painstakingly gradual process. Eros is incredibly understanding and patient and gives Psyche the space she needs to realize that she's no longer restricted, she's safe, and anything she does now is entirely her choice. I just love how their marriage is a space for both of them to explore what feels good and true and right for both of them. They're both used to a marriage being a relationship between a husband and wife, a man and a woman, and adhering to very specific gender norms. But because they don't fit those roles, much less actually want to emulate that kind of marriage in the first place, they're able to really interrogate what they do, the kinds of language they use, and ultimately what they want this marriage to look like. I love and deeply cherish that aspect of discovery and invention in the story. It's such a beautiful testimony to the power of queerness, the power of seeing a world or a space that doesn't fit who you are and daring to imagine a new one that does. The ability to inhabit new language, to find new ways to move through the world is something that is inherently queer, and I love that we get to see both characters pushing those boundaries in their own ways. A big piece of this story is also the conversation surrounding the relationship between freedom and safety. In the best of cases, those things can both exist at the same time, but even though they seem inherently related, they can also be fighting against each other sometimes. For example, Eros has built this magnificent palace that's far from the eyes of both humans and gods, and to her it feels like a place where she and Psyche can be free and be utterly themselves without fear, which is also, for her, what makes it feel safe. And while Psyche does flourish in the safety of that space as she heals from her past trauma and uncovers new aspects of her identity, her desire, and what she truly wants out of of life, it becomes clear that Eros's idea of safety makes Psyche feel trapped. She loves Eros so profoundly. She loves the life they've created together. She's grateful for the ways their marriage has allowed her to evolve and brought both of them so much joy. But not being able to share it with anyone and feeling a sense of fear or shame implied by their isolation doesn't make her feel like she's free to fully be herself. And I really respect how the story validates both of those viewpoints, especially when we're talking about queerness. Sometimes safety does take precedence over everything and anything else. Sometimes we don't have the option to live openly and carry our true selves into every single space we occupy. Some people also just don't want that either, and all of those are valid choices. Hiding yourself and protecting yourself don't inherently come from a place of shame. In fact, it often comes from a deep sense of love for yourself, because prioritizing survival means that we can hopefully make it to a better future in the first place. So I don't want that to be the takeaway here, and in fact I don't think it is. I think it's about these specific characters realizing that their needs and desires can be in sync with each other and also in conflict at the same time. Neither of those realities negates the other, and neither of them can decide what's best for both of them in that regard. Eros isn't necessarily having to reckon with the fact that her desire to hide herself is quote-unquote wrong, but that maybe it's something she personally decided out of fear, and how that choice also doesn't allow space for her feelings to change. I don't believe this story is against the concept of hiding yourself, protecting yourself, valuing your safety, or even being afraid. I think it's a testament to how either hiding yourself from the world or sharing yourself with the world shouldn't be things that you decide out of fear or for the sake of someone else. If you make either of those choices, or anything in between, it should be because it's your choice. True freedom is the ability to choose for yourself without fear of retaliation, and I think that's what the story is really trying to cultivate. This was fantastic, beautifully written, incredibly nuanced and complex, while still paying homage to the original myth and honoring the ancient Greek tradition of mythology and storytelling. Without getting specific, I do think the politics of some of the antagonists were a little anachronistic simply for the sake of causing conflict. So if I was being nitpicky, I would say that occasionally distracted me from the story, but ultimately I respect the vision of this story so much, and it was so incredibly good that I couldn't not give it 5 stars. Next, on a whim, I saw one of my favorite booksellers recommend this book in their stories, and I had to immediately check it out from my library. That was Cursed Bread by Sophie Mackintosh. I actually did a hybrid read with the audiobook from PRH Audio, which is read by Genevieve Gaunt. This is a short historical horror story, I would say more on the psychological horror and folk horror side of things, that is also deeply sapphic. It's inspired by the true story of a small French village that experienced a mass poisoning in 1951, and to this day there is still no conclusive evidence about what actually happened. So this story is kind of like Sophie Mackintosh's fictional take on what happened to that village. It's set right after World War II in France, and it follows Elodie, who is the baker's wife. She is painfully ordinary and ignored in most interactions, but when a charismatic young couple comes to town, Elodie immediately finds herself drawn into their orbit and becomes especially obsessed with the ambassador's wife, Violet. They begin spending all their time together, but they also push each other's buttons and try to see how many boundaries they can cross without anyone noticing, and so they both get drawn into this strange game of cat and mouse, except they kind of take turns being the cat and being the mouse. Content warnings for some descriptions of violence and graphic injury, as well as blood and gore, some explorations of infidelity, descriptions of dead animals and death, some sexual content, and instances of domestic violence. This was an absolute fever dream of a story. I would definitely classify it as weird fiction, and if you're in the market for a story about toxically obsessive sapphic desire, then you should definitely read this. Like I mentioned in the synopsis, this is really a story about a deeply lonely and unsatisfied woman who is desperate to feel seen or to feel some kind of connection with someone to remind her that she is, in fact, alive. So even though this is ultimately a twisted kind of horror story, we're really spending the majority of our time following Elodie in her everyday life as she painstakingly catalogs everything she sees, again, as a way to remind herself that she does exist in the world. So it's a very slow burn horror story in that way, and I really appreciate all the ways it explores how pain makes itself a constant companion to loneliness. It also explores that kind of sapphic desire where you're not sure if you want to be with someone or you want to become them, which is a very tenuous line, and I love how the story flirts with that line and oscillates back and forth between reverence and resentment. There's also some really interesting thoughts in here about the theater of performance, both on a societal level and a personal level. Elodie especially is performing the role of the dutiful wife and respectable citizen, but deep down she has these very primal, intense, shameless desires, and befriending Violet gives her the space to finally indulge those desires. And at the same time, Violet is performing normalcy as well, acting like she doesn't know how Elodie truly feels about her or what Elodie really gets from their friendship, how she's both adored and hated at the same time. The story is also exploring grief in a way because Elodie is so desperate to feel something and be something to someone, and there's also an aspect of fear that if someone does finally see her for all that she is, they'll see that she actually has nothing to offer or they won't like what they see. So that preemptive grief is also fueling the way she performs and presents herself. I do think the actual mass poisoning part of the story felt a little bit underwhelming. It felt a bit disconnected from the project of the story, and I wish there had been more mystery or strangeness surrounding why it happened or who did it, because that's very much the tone of the rest of the story. But the actual fallout and aftermath of the mass poisoning was absolutely everything I thought it would be. It was wild. Like I said, this is a strange little story that doesn't offer much in the way of satisfaction, but I also see how that's very much intentional and aligned with the real world inspiration. I'm still glad I took the time to listen to this, and I gave it 4 stars. Then in a serendipitous moment of art imitating life and vice versa, making my last recommendations video inspired me to finally read a book that's been on my TBR for almost a solid decade. That was The Queue by Basma Abdel Aziz, translated by Elizabeth Jacquet, and I also listened to the audiobook from PRH Audio, which is read by Mark Bramhall. This is a dystopian, speculative story, somewhat inspired by the very real repercussions of the Arab Spring. It's set in an alternate version of Egypt where a failed political uprising has led to the establishment of a centralized authority known only as the Gate. The Gate oversees everything and everyone. For any legal, medical, or personal decision, citizens are required to obtain permission from the Gate, and the Gate never opens. So naturally, a queue is formed and it stretches for miles as citizens from all walks of life wait to plead their cases to the Gate. And among them is a young man named Yehia who was actually injured during the uprising and has a bullet lodged in his pelvis, but his doctor can't go ahead with the operation to remove it until he has the Gate's permission. So ultimately it comes down to Yehia's doctor, Tariq, who has to decide whether to follow the Gate's protocol or risk everything to operate anyways and hopefully save Yehia's life. Content warnings for instances of sexual assault and misogyny, mentions of child death, descriptions of severe injury and medical trauma, brief allusions to rape, and references to police violence and military violence. This is a short but intense story that is every bit as powerful and relevant today as it was when it was first published, I believe, back in 2013. I really respect how this story does dystopia because it's not about the outright brutalization or elimination of the common class. It's much more subtle than that. There's no big bad, there's no fascist dictator or villain pulling the strings. Instead, it's something far more sinister because it's an oppressive force without a face. What is the Gate? Who is the Gate? Who controls the Gate? These are almost unanswerable questions by design because the Gate is a system. It's a concept, it's a way of life, and most importantly, its mandates are upheld by the very same citizens it aims to disenfranchise and oppress. And that's how the story really explores the dangers of authoritarianism, because it creates a culture of fear that encourages the people living under it to feed one another into the jaws of the beast. It creates a false moral hierarchy, a false promise of safety for those who quote-unquote follow the rules, when in fact the rules themselves can change at any moment for any reason. And we see that in the story. We see how these oppressive policies can change at a moment's notice, and how the people have been conditioned to adjust themselves because they've been fed this idea that if they do what they're supposed to do, there's still a chance they can get whatever it is that they need. It's kind of exploring how hope can be dangerous in a way, not because hope in and of itself is a bad thing or a fruitless pursuit by any means, but because hope has to be tempered with reality in order to have meaning. Humans are incredibly resilient. resilient, but there are systems and forces that will manipulate and abuse that resilience to their own ends. And so the tension in the story comes from those constantly shifting boundaries the citizens are having to navigate and make sure they don't cross, the sinister ways that the Gate's propaganda seeps into the most innocuous parts of their everyday lives. And ultimately, especially with the character of Tarek, we see how loyalty to these authoritarian systems doesn't automatically grant you safety. Falling in line and following the rules doesn't mean that you become exempt from the atrocities of the system. And while we sit around being prisoners to our own fear, twiddling our thumbs, hoping that someone somewhere will eventually do the right thing, how many people are going to be harmed or even lost while we try to motivate ourselves to do what's right? These are all really great questions, and I appreciate the way the story brings them to the forefront. I love how we get to read about so many different characters and all their different relationships to the Gate. And I also like that the goal of this story isn't to provide an answer or even really catharsis, but rather just make you sit with that discomfort and with those questions. I'm really glad I finally got to read this. The wait was very much worth it, and I gave this 4.5 stars. On a very different note, and for a very different reason, I finally picked up This Dark Descent by Kaylin Josephson, and I was kindly sent a finished copy last year from Roaring Brook Press. This is a YA fantasy story somewhat inspired by Jewish mythology about a kingdom where every 10 years there's a magical horse race, and it is equally famous for the tremendous riches it promises for the winner and the high death toll it brings with it. Our main character is Makira, who is one of the daughters of the kingdom's most famed breeders of enchanted horses, but recently the family business has been struggling to stay afloat, and when her father is found out for illegally experimenting with enchantments, he is dragged away in chains. Makira desperately tries to bargain for his life with his captors, who strike a deal with her saying that if she enters the upcoming race and wins on a non-enchanted horse, she can save her father's life. So she accepts and ends up being sponsored by a handsome, ambitious, and dangerous young lord from one of the noble houses who has plans and vendettas of his own. It's also worth noting that Makira is queer, possibly bisexual, and another side character, Ariel, is asexual and demi-romantic. Content warning for references to sibling death, parent death, and grief, some depictions of violence, blood, and injury, instances of animal injury and death, and some brief descriptions of physical torture. I'm gonna try to keep this short because I don't think I have too much to say. This is another book where I kind of have complicated feelings because overall I did enjoy it, and I do definitely plan on reading the second and final book, but it also felt like for everything I liked, there was something I didn't like. I'm just gonna be upfront and say that the world building in this story is rough at best. There's a lot of ideas and a lot of things going on in the background, but in my opinion, it's not presented in a way that's either cohesive or really accessible. And while I definitely think the story is really entertaining and has plenty of action and momentum to carry the reader through to the end, the actual plot points in the story felt very disconnected. Things just happened without any real reason as to why they were happening at that particular time or in that specific way, and the story also has a really bad habit of throwing in new obstacles or stakes only to immediately remove those stakes after a few chapters have passed. And I also felt like some of the supporting characters were more dynamic and interesting than Makira herself. But as a whole, I do feel like one of the best parts of the story is that it does have a really strong core group of characters, a strong element of found family, and I do want to know what happens to them next. The enchanted horse races were fine. I did really like the creativity behind each of them, but it also felt like they were too short for being such an important part of the story, and we also don't get to know any of Makira's competitors, which also lowers the stakes. But like I said, despite what it sounds like, I did still enjoy this. I like the relationship dynamics between the characters. I like that the female characters especially are given space to be strong and fierce and ruthless, even if performing that strength leads to them making imperfect choices. And ultimately, I do think this first book is setting up for an even more exciting conclusion, while also establishing really endearing and distinctive characters. It also very much has Eat the Rich vibes, and I'm always gonna ride for characters trying to eat the rich. The magic system is also very promising and unique. It's not every day we get to read about enchanted horses in a life or death magical race, and while I stand by my assessment that I wanted more from the races themselves, that doesn't make them any less fun to read. Listen, I wasn't lying when I said I was conflicted, but overall I had a good time with this, and while I wouldn't recommend it to absolutely everyone, I would recommend it to someone I knew very well if I thought it was in their wheelhouse. In the end, I gave this a very fair 3 stars. In August, my patrons overwhelmingly voted for me to read A Banh Mi for Two by Trinity Nguyen. I received a bound manuscript of this book from Fierce Reads Goodreads as part of a Pride Month mailing, but it actually just released at the end of August. This is a YA sapphic romance about two foodies from completely different sides of the world. We have a Vietnamese American character named Vivi who is studying abroad in Saigon, but she told her parents that she was in Singapore and they have no idea where she really is. Then we have Lan, who helps her widowed mom run the family banh mi stall. She also writes a food blog called A Banh Mi for Two, but she hasn't posted anything in a while since her father passed. I should also say that Vivi is a huge fan of Lan's writing and is using her blog as an unofficial guide through Vietnam, and the two of them happen to cross paths and together they come to an agreement. Lan will help Vivi explore Vietnam and hopefully connect with her mom's side of the family for the first time in her life, and Vivi will help Lan start writing again so she can enter a food blogging contest. Content warnings for explorations of parent death and grief, some discussions of colonial trauma, experienced racism, and war-related PTSD, and some brief allusions to child abuse. I enjoyed this, especially because I respect the end game of the story. I think for both characters, it's really about learning to reclaim your own history, learning to become an active participant in your own life after years and years of sidelining yourself, and really it's about learning to love yourself, especially by engaging with and honoring all the things that have contributed to the person you've become, even if those things are complicated. Even though they're nowhere near the same in tone or plot, this also kind of reminded me of If You Still Recognize Me by Cynthia So, one of my absolute favorite books, because they both have this sort of scavenger hunt element to them that's connected with self-discovery and emotional growth. So if that's something you enjoy, if you like contemporary stories where characters have to go on a literal journey alongside their metaphorical journey of character growth, then you'll most likely enjoy this. But like I said, this is a beautiful testament to reclaiming your own story, especially when that story hurts. We definitely see that with Lan as she navigates the grief of losing her father and feeling like that loss has disconnected her from her own life and from her ability to dream for herself. Vivi is having to navigate long-kept family secrets and intergenerational trauma that she didn't even realize she was carrying in the first place because she's never been given a chance to truly understand her own past. I appreciate the story holding space for all of that, and overall I think it features a really sweet and endearing sapphic romance that allows the characters to grow together and presents so many opportunities for the story to display the beauty and history of Vietnam, especially from a decolonial perspective. My main issue with the story is not even the fault of the author or the structure or the storytelling itself. It's because the book is objectively too short. In its final form, it is a total of 224 pages. Almost unheard of for a YA book of any genre in the traditional publishing space, and which is nowhere near long enough to let the emotional resonances of the story actually breathe, or for the story to just develop at a natural pace. Everything feels rushed. We go through months of life in Vietnam across a handful of chapters, and for everything this story is trying to accomplish, whether that's de-romanticizing the tourist industry, making space for both characters to grapple with grief and loss, enacting a dramatic shift in family dynamic for both characters, 200 pages is simply not enough. I'm not going to claim that I know who made that choice, whether it was someone on the editing team, an agent, or someone else in the publishing process, but whoever it was committed a crime against this debut author because this story deserved and needed at least 100 more pages. So keep in mind, my rating reflects the domino effect of everything impacted by that final page count rather than what the story was trying to achieve. And that's why I can really only give this 3.5 stars in good faith. This last book is a little bit tricky to talk about because I am going to finish it for sure by the end of August, but I'm filming this a few days before August ends, so I haven't finished it yet. But that is Prince of the Palisades by Julian Winters. Penguin Teen very kindly sent me a review copy, but this also recently came out on August 20th. This is a super fun, queer, YA contemporary romance about Jaden, who is the prince of a fictional kingdom called Reverie. However, after a horribly public breakup with his ex goes viral, and after he was secretly filmed slandering one of the kingdom's politicians, he's been unofficially exiled to California to clean up his act. So not only is he on this redemption tour that involves a lot of interviews, public appearances, and positive press, but he's been enrolled in a private school where he's supposed to just be a normal teenager and hopefully make some friends. What his entourage didn't account for is Jaden falling for a not-so-royal American boy named Reese, and if he wants to win Reese over, he might just have to figure out how to be himself. Like I said, I'm still very much reading this in real time, so I can't give a comprehensive list of content warnings. I can't tell you my final star rating or my final thoughts, but I can tell you what I think so far. This has been such a delight so far. It's so much fun to read, and it's kind of a different angle from the kinds of stories that Julian usually writes. Most times he centers these like really nice, innocent characters with a great heart or a good head on their shoulders, and that's not to say that Jaden isn't a good guy. He definitely is. But when the story starts, even he doesn't know it yet. He's also way more extroverted than the kinds of characters that Julian usually writes, and he's so used to acting pretentious and entitled in order to protect himself. It's like a mask that he wears to separate himself from the non-royal population because he knows he can never just be a normal, worry-free teenager who does whatever they want without any consequences. Intellectually, I know this story is loosely inspired by Julian's love of the TV show Young Royals, but it kind of reminds me personally of a gender-bent Princess Diaries AU. Like, what if Mia, who was also born from a non-royal American mother and became heir to a fictional throne, always knew that she was a princess and lived her entire life in Genovia and never knew what it meant to be a normal teenager? This story is kind of playing out that thought experiment and showing Jaden being presented with this chance to just be a kid for the first time in his life, to stop detaching himself from the things and people that really matter, and to find out what it means to lead as a prince. I always say this, but there are authors who return to a familiar thematic through line again and again and again, and Julian is one of those authors. And I think that's a great thing because all of his stories, in their own unique way, ask this question of what it means to really become yourself when you still don't know who you are and when you might never actually know. I don't think that's a question that loses its importance or its relevance no matter how many times we ask. And I appreciate that this story is coming back to that question once again, while also giving us an abundance of queer black boy joy with a royal tilt that's just so much fun to read. Again, I don't have a final verdict or a star rating to sum up my feelings about this book yet, but I can say that if it continues the same way it has, then there's a very high chance it could become a new favorite. So those are all the books I read in August. There were so many of them. I've been talking for 10 years at this point. But if you've read any of these books yourself, or if you plan to, please stop by the comments because I would love to hear your thoughts. Thank you so much for watching this super long wrap up. And until next time, educate yourself, be kind to yourself, take care of yourself and others, and I will catch you on the flip side of the page.